Chassis Service Review. This film is a review of the motorhome general maintenance schedule with emphasis on particular chassis components where, under unusual operating conditions, extra service attention is required to assure dependability and owner satisfaction. The maintenance schedule, delivered with every motorhome and also contained in the maintenance manual, is based on normal vehicle use. Normal use is defined as carrying passengers and cargo within the weight limitations indicated on the vehicle identification plate in the vehicle and operation on reasonable road surfaces within legal operating speeds. Unusual operating conditions, and the majority of motorhomes are subjected to them at least part of the time, require shorter maintenance intervals than are indicated in the schedule. What operating conditions are considered unusual? Well, one is operation in mountainous areas. This can put heavy demands on the drivetrain and possibly on the brakes and cooling system. Another is trailer towing. Towing a boat, car, or trailer of any sort can mean perhaps 5,000 pounds of extra weight and extra strain on the vehicle. Stop-and-go in-city driving puts additional stress on the drivetrain, and more frequent changing of the lubricants is needed to prevent premature mechanical problems. Operating a motorhome on gravel roads and in dusty campsites means air filters should be cleaned or replaced more frequently. Operation in temperature extremes, both hot and cold, are considered unusual conditions and require a stepped-up maintenance schedule. After a motorhome has been run long distances over wet or snowy roads, particularly in cold weather where salt may be present, certain maintenance operations should be performed to prevent corrosion damage. So, periodic inspections, maintenance, and service parts replacements can't be based strictly on time and mileage. Where and how the vehicle is used must also be taken into consideration. Now let's go through the maintenance schedule and look at those specific areas where, under the unusual operating conditions just described, more frequent maintenance may be needed. We'll also touch on a few items that are sometimes neglected or overlooked during routine vehicle maintenance. We'll look first at some items in Section A of the schedule, lube and general maintenance. The first item is chassis lubrication. Under normal conditions, this should be done every 3 months or 3,000 miles using a chassis grease meeting GM specification 6031M. This interval is adequate under normal, mostly dry weather driving conditions. However, under adverse conditions, wet weather or wintertime driving on snow or slush-covered roads, it may not be often enough. Under these conditions, large amounts of water laden with dirt and possibly corrosive salt are thrown directly at the rear suspension pivot pins. Lubricant can be washed out of the pivot pin bushings, resulting in corrosion and premature wear. Under these adverse conditions, lubrication of the pivot pin bushings is recommended at least every 1,000 miles, or better yet, after each trip. Now let's look at item A9, automatic transmission fluid and final drive lubricant change. Due to the demands placed on the transmission and final drive in a motorhome, even in normal use, it is mandatory that both the transmission and final drive fluids be changed every 12 months or 12,000 miles. When severe demands are placed on the transmission, constant in-city operation, trailer towing, driving in mountainous areas, fluid temperature is much higher. So is pressure in many instances. The fluid loses its lubricating and cooling effectiveness more rapidly. Under conditions like these, the fluid change interval should be cut in half to every 6 months or 6,000 miles. Investigations have shown that when the fluid change interval is reduced to suit operating conditions, mechanical problems are minimized. When it's not, component failures are far more prevalent. The filter, of course, should be changed each time the transmission fluid is changed. Similarly, heavy demands are placed on the final drive unit under unusual operating conditions. At high temperatures, lubricant additives are consumed, and the protective film between mating surfaces can break down, leading to premature failure of gears and bearings. Like the transmission, if operating conditions are continuously severe, The change interval should be cut in half to 6 months or 6,000 miles. To replace the final drive lubricant, remove the cover attaching bolts. Have a drain pan ready, as the lube will begin to drain as the bolts are loosened. Install the cover using a new gasket. Torque the attaching bolts to 24 pounds-feet. Be sure the vent hole is open and the shield over the vent hole is properly installed to keep out dirt. Add 4 pints of SAE 80W or 80W90 GL5 gear lubricant. The lubricant level should be at the fill plug hole. Proper cooling system maintenance is obviously important in a motorhome. It's cheap insurance against unpleasant trip delays and perhaps costly repairs, yet sometimes the system is neglected. Going by the schedule, Item A4 calls for a check of the fluid level every 6 months or 6,000 miles. Item A10 specifies that at each 12-month or 12,000-mile interval, the radiator core and air conditioning condenser should be cleaned, hoses and clamps inspected, and the system and radiator cap pressure checked. Also, in accordance with Schedule Item A10, the cooling system should be drained, flushed, and refilled with new coolant. While the coolant does not lose its ability to give freeze protection as it ages, it does lose its ability to provide protection against rust and corrosion. Also, as the coolant additives are consumed, an electrolytic action takes place that attacks metal parts. Hoses tend to deteriorate more rapidly, too. That's why it's important to change the coolant every 2 years or 24,000 miles. A high-quality coolant meeting GM SPEC 1899M should be used. The last item in Section A of the schedule is a check of the final drive boots and output shaft seals. These seals are particularly prone to damage if the vehicle is driven a lot on gravel roads or over rough terrain. If the seal is split or torn, dirt can quickly ruin an expensive constant velocity joint. To completely inspect the seals, the wheels must be rotated. Be sure all clamps are in position and tight. Next, let's review several items in Section B, Safety, and Section C, Emission Controls, which are important but sometimes don't get the service attention they need. The first is B5, Suspension and Steering Check. The schedule calls for this check every 6 months or 6,000 miles. A convenient time to do it is at every other chassis lube. Worn or loose parts can be missed unless they're checked by feel. Pull back and forth on the tie rod assemblies, drag link, idler arm, and intermediate rod to check for excessive play or lost motion in any of the connecting points. Check for excessive free play in the front wheel bearings and ball joints by grasping each wheel at the top and bottom and shaking in and out. Owners, of course, should have any worn parts replaced without delay. Another safety item is a check of the rear drum brakes. It's recommended every 12 months or 12,000 miles. Again, this is adequate under normal driving conditions, but more frequent checks should be made if driving conditions and habits result in frequent brake applications. Whenever the brake drums are removed, an inspection of the bearings should be routine. The maintenance schedule calls for cleaning and repacking of the rear wheel bearings every 24,000 miles. They should be repacked with lithium soap multi-purpose grease, meeting GM SPEC 6031M or the equivalent. Don't use long fiber or viscous type greases. It's important to use the correct procedure when reinstalling the hub and drum assembly. It's similar to the procedure used at the front wheels of most conventional cars and trucks. Tighten the nut 25 to 30 pounds-feet. Be sure to rotate the drum while tightening. That positions the bearings properly in the cones. The next step is to back off the nut 1/2 turn, then retighten it finger tight. This establishes the proper bearing tightness or preload. Secure the nut in this position with a new cotter pin. If the slot in the nut doesn't line up with the hole in the spindle at the finger tight position, back off the nut until it does. End play between the hub and spindle should be from 1 to 5 thousandths of an inch. At the front wheels, the front bearing has a 24,000-mile service interval. Something important for you to know is that the drive axle nut does not establish bearing preload. The nut secures the disc and hub assembly to the drive axle. The tightness of the nut has no effect whatsoever on bearing preload. Bearing preload is automatically established when the bearings are installed in the steering knuckle. Whenever the hub and rotor assembly is removed for any reason, this is the procedure you should follow to reinstall the drive axle nut. First, install the washer and nut and torque 110 to 140 pounds-feet. To align the cotter pin slot, tighten the nut, don't back it off. But don't torque it to more than 280 pounds-feet. Then install a new cotter pin. In Section C, Emission Control Maintenance, an important item is replacement of the carburetor fuel filter. This filter is often overlooked during routine maintenance, and at least one vacation trip is known to have been interrupted because this filter wasn't replaced when it should have been. The element's appearance can be deceiving. It can look clean, yet be so clogged with dirt and scale that gasoline won't pass through it. That's because the direction of flow is from the inside out. Dirt is trapped on the inside surfaces where you can't readily see it. In addition, moisture over a period of time will expand the fibers in the element paper, reducing the paper's porosity. It can reach a point where air will not flow through, yet it still looks serviceable. To avoid problems of fuel starvation or hard starting, owners should be advised to change the carburetor fuel filter at least as often as called for in their maintenance schedule, every 12 months or 12,000 miles. Another system that owners sometimes neglect is Schedule Item C13, the ECS system check and filter replacement. This is an inspection of all the evaporation control system fuel and vapor lines and hoses, and the vapor canisters. It also requires replacement of the filter in the bottom of the canister. The fuel tanks are vented through the canister. If the filter becomes clogged, fuel supply problems can result. The filter can be cleaned in solvent or gasoline, but then it loses some of its effectiveness. The schedule calls for replacement every 24 months or 24,000 miles. It should be done more often than that if the vehicle is operated frequently under heavy dust conditions. One further item on the fuel system. It concerns motorhomes that are not used regularly and may be parked for rather lengthy periods. When not used for shorter periods of time, perhaps a few weeks, the fuel tank should be kept full. With no airspace in the tanks, water vapor cannot condense in the tanks, so the owner avoids the problem of getting water in his fuel. If the vehicle is to be stored for a longer period, several months or more, the fuel tanks, carburetor, fuel pump, and all lines should be drained of gasoline. This prevents the formation of gum deposits and water accumulation. Each fuel tank has a drain plug in the front left corner. The final item we're going to look at is the Onan motor generator. Few get the attention and service they need. Part of this is because many owners don't realize how quickly the hours of operation add up. For example, the maintenance schedule calls for cleaning the air filter every 100 hours, more often under extremely dusty conditions. This seems like a long time, but 100 hours of generator operation can easily be accumulated in 2 long weekends at a campsite. And 100 hours of operation in a dusty area will usually mean serious clogging of the air filter, resulting in poor performance and high fuel consumption. The motor generator service requirements are included in the maintenance schedule. Owners should be urged to keep track of the hours of operation and see that all the services are performed on schedule.